It is not important to be better than someone else, but to be better than yesterday. Kano Jigoro. It's interesting how we look at change. When we think about improving our lives, our mind usually goes to the massive shifts. We think about big career pivots, a complete lifestyle overhaul, or the day everything magically falls into place. It's a comfortable way to look at progress because it keeps the pressure off of today. It lets us treat growth like a future event, something that happens later when the circumstances are a bit smoother or when we finally feel ready. But if you look closely at the people who actually seem to have it together, you'll realize something else is happening. They aren't waiting for a massive wave. They're just focused on tiny, marginal, subtle shifts, a fraction of an inch today that sets them up for tomorrow. In fact, most of the time, it looks completely insignificant to anyone watching from the outside. However, we get so caught up looking for that giant leap that we completely miss the ground right in front of us. We spend our energy complaining about the chaos of the world, our hectic schedules, or the lack of time, using it all as a shield to protect our comfort. But here's the truth we have to face if we actually want to move forward. You don't get to complain about the state of your life when you're actively neglecting the few things you actually control. The macro transformation you keep waiting for doesn't exist. There's only right now and the standard you choose to uphold today. On the other hand, let's look at this a little differently. Think about how numbers work. If you manage to get just 1% better at something every single day, you don't just end up in a 2 + 2 = 4 kind of better. Because progress doesn't add up linearly. It compounds. It builds on itself day after day, like interest in a bank account. And down the road, that tiny 1% daily shift multiplies into something much greater than where you started. But there's a flip side to that math, and it's where many of us mess it up. If you let things slide by just 1% every day, cutting that corner, letting that standard drop, even just a fraction, you don't just stay in the same place. You compound downward. But the most important aspect to remember is, regardless the direction, a 1% decision feels like absolutely nothing at the time. Choosing to read 5 pages or choosing to scroll on your phone for an hour doesn't alter the course of your life the following morning. The consequences are completely invisible in that moment. We convince ourselves that these tiny choices don't matter because they're so small. But nothing we do is truly neutral. Every single thing we choose to execute or choose to neglect is a turn in the direction we're heading. We're either building momentum or we're letting it erode, 1% at a time. It's a constant accumulation, and it's happening whether you acknowledge it or not. Now, that makes sense on paper. But executing it in the real world, different story. The real problem isn't understanding the logic. It's dealing with how it actually feels when you're in the middle of it. Because that growth curve has a huge blind spot when you're starting. It's called the plateau of latent potential. It's that long stretch where you're putting in the effort every single day, but nothing seems to be changing. In all honesty, it often just feels like boredom and frustration. You go to the gym. You avoid the junk food. You work on that project. You hold your tongue when you want to speak your mind. But at the end of that proverbial day, the needle doesn't seem to have moved. It's a psychological vacuum. We're wired to expect immediate rewards. So when we don't see a visible payoff for that discipline that we have, our brains start telling us that the effort isn't worth it. This is exactly where most people break down and quit. They assume that because the progress is invisible, it must be non-existent. But the work isn't being wasted. It's just being stored. If you don't learn to tolerate the quiet, the grind, the days where nothing seems to happen. You'll never survive long enough to see the results compound. You have to find a way to navigate that empty space without letting the lack of immediate feedback trick you into dropping your standard. So then how do you actually survive that flat stretch without losing your mind? It comes down to changing your relationship with the work itself. Most of the time, we treat our daily goals like a negotiation with our mood. We wake up, we check our internal fuel level, and decide if we feel motivated enough to do what we said we'd do. But motivation, it's completely unreliable. It's a feeling. And feelings change based on how much sleep you got, what happened at work, or what someone said to you an hour ago. The breakthrough happens when you stop checking your mood and start relying on discipline. There's a quiet, unshakable confidence that comes from completely eliminating that internal debate. Imagine waking up and not having to argue with yourself. Just admit it. You do it. We all do it. But you have the conversation about whether you're going to handle that difficult task, whether you're going to get that workout in, or whether you're going to journal like you said you would. Having dedication means it's already decided. The standard is set, and it doesn't care about your excuses. When you remove that constant negotiation, you save an incredible amount of mental and emotional energy. You aren't burning fuel trying to force yourself to feel like doing the work. You're just executing because you've made it who you are. Now, this isn't about being robotic or unfeeling. However, it's actually incredibly freeing. It brings a deep sense of internal peace because you realize your success is no longer at the mercy of unpredictable emotion. You create a baseline of predictability that keeps you anchored, no matter how chaotic things get around you. And once you experience that kind of clarity, you stop looking for external sparks to light your fire. You just become the person who shows up because the flame is always lit. However, to make that predictability work over the long haul, you have to look at reality. It's easy to talk about maintaining an unshakable standard when life is running smoothly. But what happens when things go sideways? What happens when you're exhausted? Because you will be exhausted. Your schedule will get thrown out the window. Your family will need you more. Or a project at work, that'll become your highest priority. This is where a lot of people can break because they mistake rigidity for strength. They build a system that only works on their absolute best days. And the moment life throws a wrench in the gears, the whole thing goes off the rails. If your standard is so inflexible that it requires perfect conditions to survive, it isn't a standard. It's more of a liability. Real consistency requires elasticity. You have to build a system that can bend without breaking. The secret isn't about hitting your maximum performance every single day. It's about ensuring the frequency of the habit, even when the intensity has to drop. Think of it as creating a non-negotiable floor. It's your system's baseline. If your plan was to study for an hour, but your day explodes, the elastic response isn't to skip it entirely and tell yourself that I'll just catch up tomorrow. The response is to open the book for 10 minutes. If you can't get in a full workout, you don't just blow it off. You do some push-ups, sit-ups, and air squats before going to bed. Something is always better than nothing. In essence, you lower the barrier for completion low enough that it takes more energy to make an excuse than it does to just execute. By adjusting the volume, but refusing to skip the action, you keep the chain intact. You signal to your brain that the commitment is permanent, even if the capacity varies. That elasticity is what turns rigidity into resilience. And it's a lifelong pattern. And when you manage to protect that baseline day after day, something happens beneath the surface. It's more than simply ticking boxes off a to-do list, or accumulating a journal entry of small wins. The real transformation isn't what you're getting, it's who you're becoming. Every time you hold the line on that elastic standard, especially on the days you absolutely don't want to, you're solidifying the foundation of your identity. However, in many instances, we try to change our lives in reverse order. We think that we need to believe we're confident, capable, and disciplined before we can start acting like it. We wait for that internal shift to happen first. But the human brain doesn't actually work that way. Your brain is an observer. It observes your behavior and builds its perception about who you are based on the evidence you prove. If you constantly make promises to yourself and break them when you feel tired or stressed, your brain updates its internal profile. You're someone who gives up when it's uncomfortable. And even with all the positive thinking or self-talk, fixing that subconscious lack of trust is difficult, if not impossible. Think about it. There's been something that you got out of the habit of doing. Now think about the amount of effort it took to get back going again. But when you show up consistently, when you refuse to negotiate with your mood, and you protect that daily floor, you give your brain undeniable proof of your own reliability. You build an authentic architecture of self-leadership. You stop being someone who's trying to get better, and you start realizing that you're simply someone who executes. That's an internal shift. It changes everything. It changes how you carry yourself, how you handle adversity, and what you're willing to tolerate from yourself and others. True confidence isn't a loud, artificial feeling that you pump yourself up with. It's the quiet, solid knowledge that you can actually trust your own discipline. At some point, the talking has to stop, and the adaptation has to begin. It's easy to listen to ideas like these, nod along, and feel a temporary surge of acknowledgement. But that feeling isn't progress. It's just an emotional echo. The real work happens in the quiet, completely uneventful moments when nobody else is watching and the initial inspiration has completely faded. When you look at the trajectory of your life, it's rarely defined by the dramatic crises or the rare strokes of luck. It's defined by the small, ordinary decisions you make when you're tired, when you're unmotivated, or stretched extremely thin. Those are the moments that quietly shape your reality. So as you move back into the noise of your day, take a look at the standards you've been tolerating. Notice where you've been waiting for the perfect mood, or where you've been letting a tiny compromise drift into a permanent habit. You don't need a massive overhaul to change direction. You just need to look at the very next choice in front of you and decide what kind of confirmation you're going to choose right now. As always, thanks for spending a few minutes with me. Until next time, stay sharp, stay grounded, and keep showing up.